on the 2018 Taiwan local elections by Kharis Templeman. I'm Carl Eikenberry. I'm the director of the U.S. Asia Security Initiative, and today's event is sponsored by the U.S. Asia Security Initiative of the Asia-Pacific Research Center, and in particular by our Taiwan Democracy and Security Project. I'm going to be very brief in words of introduction because Kharis really has a lot of ground to cover, and we want to allocate a lot of time for discussion and to address your questions. On November the 24th, just a little under a week ago now, Taiwan held local elections, as all of you know, and had a very impressive voter turnout, as I know Kharis will talk about in his remarks. The somewhat surprising results of this election have implications at various levels geopolitically and in various domains around the world. First, it obviously has implications for today and at least the next 2 years for Taiwan's politics and importantly for its economic policies. Going beyond that, it has important consequences and implications for the 2020 presidential election in Taiwan. It also matters in terms of cross-Strait relations between Taiwan and the mainland, and indeed between U.S. and Taiwan, and between the U.S. and China. And I think it has implications more broadly for security across the Western Pacific and East Asia. Two other questions. When countries around the world, from Australia to Sri Lanka to the United States of America, are examining carefully PRC efforts to achieve its policy objectives through the use of so-called sharp power, ask the question, did Beijing play an important role or any role at all in shaping the outcomes of the November 24th election? And then last question, when we find democracies around the world in an area of stress, which is something that if we look over the greater course of history, democracies periodically come under stress. The stress that our own United States democracy has right now is not unprecedented in our history. But we see democracies around the world under stress. What can Taiwan's recent elections and own vibrant democracy tell the world's open and inclusive governments and societies? We have today with us absolutely the right person and the right scholar and policy expert, Kharis Templeman, to explore these issues and these questions. I think that most of you here know Kharis well. For those that don't, he's the project manager of the Taiwan Democracy and Security Project within the U.S. Asia Security Initiative. He's also a social science research scholar at the Shorenstein Asia-Pacific Research Center, or APARC, here at Stanford University. He's a fluent speaker of Mandarin Chinese. He's lived and worked and traveled extensively in Taiwan and in the mainland. His current research activities include projects on party system institutionalization and partisan realignments, on electoral integrity and manipulation throughout East Asia, and I find very interesting his work that he does on the politics of defense spending in Taiwan. His most recent publication is The China Model: How Successful is the Chinese Regime? And it was a review essay in the Taiwan Journal of Democracy. And also recently, the editor with Larry Diamond and Yunhan Zhu of Taiwan, book titled Taiwan's Democracy Challenge, the Chen Shui-bian Years. Kharis also serves as the coordinator of the American Political Science Association Conference Group on Taiwan Studies. He holds a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Rochester, a PhD in Political Science from the University of Michigan. I've come to know Kharis in recent years here at Stanford University, and with each day becoming an increasingly big fan of his excellent scholarship and I also consider him a good friend. So, Kharis.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and I want to thank all of you for coming out for this talk. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to speak on Taiwan's local elections. This was my first love as a graduate student, was Taiwanese politics and elections, and so I actually get to talk about like my core interests today. And so even though I suspect many of you in the room might be disappointed in the results of this election, I'm still an enthusiastic fan of the process of democracy, parties, and elections in Taiwan, and I'm going to try not to overwhelm you with too many details in this talk, but give you a sense of what I think happened in this election right now. Right? Also, before I jump in, I just want to call attention to the fact that I forgot a political party up here that actually won council seats. Does anybody know what it is? What's missing up there? The Tree Party didn't win any seats. Nobody can come up with this? Wow. Well, that tells you where this party is headed. It's Thailand. I forgot the Taiwan Solidarity Union up there. So both I and Taiwanese voters are forgetting about Thailand now. So anyway, jumping right in here. I'll start with what happened, the spoiler, and that is this was a big Kuomintang win. The KMT is the opposition party currently in Taiwan, although it was the longtime ruling party until 2000, and then came back into power in 2008 and lasted until 2016. In 2016, the KMT got beat very, very badly in the presidential election, and there was a lot of speculation that it was in terminal decline. And so that is most emphatically not the case after these election results came out. The KMT actually had an almost clean sweep of all the toss-up races in this election. In particular, there were a couple stunning upsets. The biggest one was in Kaohsiung, which is the southern metropolitan area in Taiwan. Kaohsiung has been a DPP-controlled municipality for 20 years. It's part of the so-called Southern Green Heartland of DPP supporters. And before this election cycle started, no one had this race on their map. Nobody expected this to be even a competitive race. And in the end, this KMT nominee, Han Guoyu, ran a very unorthodox campaign, caught fire in social media and then in traditional media, and by the end was not only campaigning in Kaohsiung, but around the island for all the other KMT candidates, because he had attracted so much attention and enthusiasm from the Pan-Blue base. And so he won in Kaohsiung, ending 20 years of DPP rule there. In Taichung, Taichung has traditionally been a swing city in Taiwan. It's in the center of Taiwan. It's split about evenly between the two major parties. The sitting legislator Liu Xiuyan won a convincing victory in this election over the incumbent DPP mayor Lin Jialong. As a result, when these election results came out, Tsai Ing-wen, the current DPP president of Taiwan, and also the party chairwoman, resigned as party chairwoman within just a couple of hours of the scope of the defeat becoming known. In addition, there were, for the first time in Taiwan, public referendums held on 10 different issues, 10 different questions. Voters decisively rejected several referendums, one being approval for same-sex marriage. Among the Sunflower Movement group and the kind of social progressive movement that was really appeared to be ascendant in 2014 and 16, there was a lot of disappointment on election night, and conversely, a lot of enthusiasm and exuberant jubilation in the KMT camp. For the rest of this talk, now that you know kind of the basic details of what happens, I'm going to dig in first with a closer look at the election results. I'm going to talk more specifically about what happened in individual races and the general trends. Second, I'm going to talk in some detail about why I think this was a significant DPP defeat. And I'll put the emphasis here on DPP defeat rather than KMT victory. I think this was mostly an anti-DPP vote rather than a pro-KMT vote. And I'll talk a bit more about that. And then I'm going to talk a bit about implications for domestic politics in Taiwan going forward over the next 14 months. There's actually the next presidential election is scheduled to be held in January of 2020. And then finally I'll talk, because everybody outside of Taiwan who pays attention to Taiwan, or most people, are interested first and foremost in cross-Strait and U.S. Taiwan and the U.S. PRC Taiwan triangle set of relations. I'll talk a bit about the implications of these elections for that set of relations as well. All right. So what happened? The election results. Well, I should emphasize here that these are local elections. There are no national offices at stake in these elections, but every other elected office in Taiwan was on the ballot this time around. And so these are really big. There are over 11,000 different elected offices at stake, and they involve 9 different kinds of races. So I've put them all up here. The key ones, the ones that everybody pays attention to, are the county and city executives. So Taiwan has 6 special municipalities. The mayors and the city councilors are all on the ballot in this election. In the special municipalities, there are certain districts that are supposed self-governing indigenous districts, and they have the right to elect their own district leaders and councilors. And then there are non-municipal counties and cities that also elect mayors, county executives, and councilors. And then finally, a level below that, there are township-level leaders, so township heads and township councilors. And then at the bottom, in the rural areas, we have village chiefs who are elected and ward chiefs in cities like Taipei who are elected. So an individual voter going into the polling booth in Taiwan might receive as many as 5 different ballots for 5 different races. In addition, I didn't mention it here, but for the first time there were referendums here, and because there were 10 different referendums, voters also got 10 different pieces of paper that had a referendum question on it. And so in some races, voters were getting 15 different ballots and carrying those into the polling places. So this was an unprecedentedly complicated election for Taiwan. I want to emphasize that it didn't always used to be this way. Taiwan used to hold all of these elections at separate times, and the effect of that was to keep elections very localized. So national issues generally did not drive local election results. It mattered more who the personalities were campaigning for office, what local issues were salient in those districts or those jurisdictions, and also factional strengths or personality conflicts within a particular locality. That all changed in 2014 when they combined the special municipality elections, which were last held in 2010, with the county and city elections, and they also combined a couple counties and cities to create this new omnibus election in 2014. And so this became known as the Jiuhe, or the 9-in-1 local elections, and they were held for the first time in 2014. So this is only the second cycle of this. The other thing I'd note here is that in 2014, that was a very green year. You can see the map is much greener than it was over here. That means the DPP did very, very well in 2014. And so the 2018 election, where the KMT recovered quite a bit, is actually potentially a reversion closer to the mean relative to 2014. Okay? And you can see this here. So, pretty green map in 2014. In 2018, the KMT flipped a total of, I have it on here actually, 9. Yeah, they flipped 9 jurisdictions, 2 from independents to KMT candidates, and 7 from DPP to independent to KMT candidates. And in addition, the DPP, they were hoping to be competitive in a couple of places such as Taiwan. The DPP candidate actually ended up not being particularly competitive there. It wasn't a particularly close race. And you notice there's one little speck of black still on the map. That is in Taipei, where the incumbent independent mayor, Ko Wen-je, squeaked out re-election with about 4,000 votes to spare. I'm going to highlight two of the kind of marquee races in this election. I mentioned Taichung and Kaohsiung earlier. Both of these were expected to be competitive, and potentially the DPP candidate was favored going into this election. And so, on a personal note, when I woke up the morning of the elections and actually looked at the results, this result stunned me. A 53% vote for the KMT at Kaohsiung is just astounding. In 2014, the DPP candidate there won 2 votes to every 1 vote of the KMT candidate. And in 2016, Tsai Ing-wen carried Kaohsiung with 63% of the vote. And so this was a very, very green municipality, according to the results of the last 2 elections. And so the fact that the KMT... Oops, this should be flipped. This should be flipped. My apologies. Yes. Yes. When this says DPP, that should be KMT. I knew I was going to make a mistake somewhere. Yeah, and in fact, these are flipped as well. Good Lord. Oh.
Are you pro-green?
Good question. I'm pro-democracy. Let's put it that way. All right, let me dig into these a little bit more. In Kaohsiung, like I said, this was a shocker, in part because we had a fairly conventional DPP candidate here. Chen Chi-mai won the DPP primary, beat several other formidable DPP candidates for the DPP nomination. In the beginning of this election campaign, nobody expected he would have any trouble winning re-election. And then sometime during the fall, his polling numbers, internally and externally, started to fall, and the KMT candidates started to rise. And there was this sense of panic, really, in the pan-green camp. And so Tsai Ing-wen, Chen Ju, the former mayor, and a bunch of other DPP figures all went down to Kaohsiung to campaign. And so towards the end, it looked like they might have actually turned it around, given their body language and their expressions of confidence before the election. So I think the DPP was actually pretty shocked by this result, too. I got it right here. So Hangguo you won. Taichung, as I mentioned, is a swing region of Taiwan. The incumbent mayor, Lin Jialong, had previously been a legislator from Taichung. He had won a big victory in 2014, defeating the incumbent KMT mayor. He's, I would say he's pretty well connected within the DPP party elite. And so he was a formidable candidate for re-election in Taichung. But this was kind of a strength-on-strength campaign. On the other side, Wu Xiuyan is a sitting legislator from the KMT, also from Taichung. She was one of the biggest overperformers in the 2016 legislative election. I think she's one of 2 or 3 candidates who actually won districts that Tsai Ing-wen also carried, candidates from the KMT who did that. And so this is a good bellwether. It's a good indication of where the partisan leaning was in the electorate this time around. And so the scope of this victory should make you sit up and take notice. If we think of Taichung as normally a 50-50 region of Taiwan, the fact that the KMT won almost 57% of the vote suggests that there was a major swing towards the party national. And then finally, in Taipei, there was a complicated 3-way race. Ko Wen-je won in 2014 as an independent, but he was supported and effectively endorsed by the Democratic Progressive Party and won a very large victory in 2014. In 2018, the DPP decided not to re-endorse him and instead to run their own nominee, Yao Wen-ju. If anybody was around here last year in this building, Yao Wen-ju was actually visiting here for a couple of weeks. And so you may have seen him in the halls. But he's also a sitting legislator, pushed very hard for the DPP to not renominate or not re-support Ke, and instead run a DPP candidate. And then on the KMT side, the KMT nominated a pretty old school is probably the right word. Ding Xiaozhong is a longtime legislator, was defeated in 2016, but ran as the nominee in this campaign. And the results were very, very close. There's about 4,000 votes difference between the KMT's nominee and Ke Wen-je. And this was closer than expected too. Polls going into this race suggested that Yao was not getting any traction even with DPP voters, that Ke was holding on both to DPP supporters and to a significant number of Pan-Blue supporters, and that Ding probably had a ceiling of about 40% of the vote. And then in the last couple of weeks of the campaign, Yao actually started to rise in the polls, as far as we can tell, and peeled off a significant number of former Ke supporters. And if this had gone on for another week, I think Ke probably would have lost this. Trends were not in his favor, so he squeaked this one out. Just to give you an idea of the national vote share in these executive elections, this is 2014, where the DPP outpolled the KMT by about 7%. In 2016, the KMT's national vote share is even larger than the DPP's was in 2014. So the KMT outpolled them by almost 10%. All right. If we plot these elections over a longer time period, I've just taken the two-party vote share in each of the major elections since 2004. So this is the 2004 presidential election, the local elections in 2005 and 6, 2008 presidential election, and so on and so forth. And what I'll have you note is, starting in 2014, there's a significant KMT decline. And so a lot of observers looked at the last two elections and thought, this line is going to continue down. The KMT is in a death spiral right now. And instead, here's what happened in this election. So the KMT, at least judging by the national vote share, really did have a significant revival in this election. I'm going to say just a little bit about the councilors. So this is at the municipal level. In addition to electing a mayor directly, Taiwanese voters also get to elect a council member from their district. And this uses a multi-member district system, so single non-transfer vote. That means that individual voters can only vote for one candidate, but multiple candidates from the same district can win. So the consequence of that is that smaller parties have a better shot in these elections. You can win a seat with as little as 10% of the vote in some of these districts. And so smaller parties, while not running candidates in any of the executive races, did run council candidates all over the island. And so if we're expecting to see the growth of third parties, this is where we would see it. And so that's one reason I'm focusing on these elections as well. So let me show you what happened over time. So this is councilors in 2009 and 10. Blue KMT, green DPP, gray is independents. Taiwan has a large number of independents who win in these council races in each election. And these tiny little lines up here are all of the other candidates affiliated with small parties. So a very small number. I'm frozen. So, as you can see, there's a significant decline in the number of DPP councilors who won in this election, a small jump in the number of KMT councilors, and a significant increase, although from a very small base, of the small party candidates who won. So, small party candidates who won, 22, an increase there. And in particular, I want to highlight one party, the New Power Party, or Shidai Liliang, which is a new party, first ran in 2016. It ran councillor candidates all over the island, and it won 16 seats, which is more than any other small party won anywhere. A couple more traditional parties, the People First Party, which has been around since 2001, held on. Taiwan Solidarity Union, which I forgot on the first slide, they have now 5 seats, same as last time. The Republic Party, which is a new party, won 3 seats. And then some kind of scattered success of small issue-oriented parties like the Green Party and the Social Democratic Party. But generally speaking, Taiwan is still a green-blue duopoly. The KMT wins a lot of seats, the DPP wins a lot of seats, independents win a lot of seats, and then the small parties are still a very small share of the total. Finally, let me talk a little bit about the referendums in Taiwan during this election. So Taiwan has had a referendum act since 2003 when then President Chen Shui-bian pushed to pass this act through the legislature, and his motivations were pretty transparently to try to rally his deep green independence base towards his campaign for 2004. And this referendum, after a fair amount of pressure from the United States, Carl probably remembers this very well, the referendum law actually included some highly restrictive clauses to make a referendum valid and to actually hold a referendum. One was that the president could not call a referendum by himself unless there was some kind of imminent security threat to Taiwan. And Chen Shui-bian said, okay, we'll put that in, and then as soon as it was passed, went right around that clause and said, we're facing an imminent security threat. China has missiles pointed towards us. I'm calling a defensive referendum. There were also a couple other clauses, though, that meant that referendums, in effect, this was not, referendums were unlikely to pass in these elections. The most important is a turnout threshold of 50% of all eligible voters. And so in 2004 and in 2008, when referendums were on the ballot, either one camp or the other boycotted the referendums that the other camp proposed, and so they came nowhere near meeting that 50% threshold. This became, so I mentioned that, this became a big issue, especially among the social progressive camp in Taiwan, the New Power Party, and elements of the DPP. They wanted to see this referendum act actually usable. They wanted to see it function as it was intended. And so they successfully advocated for changes to the act to lower the turnout threshold and the signature requirements to qualify stuff for the ballot. And so in December 2017, the DPP majority in the legislature, supported by the New Power Party, actually lowered the turnout threshold to 25% from 50%. As an added bonus, they lowered the voting age, but only for referendums, from 20, where it still is in Taiwan for all local elections and national elections, to 18 for the referendums. And so Taiwan now has this referendum act that allows people as young as 18 to vote, but voters who went to the polls this year who were 18 or 19 could only vote for the referendums, not for candidates. And so it created an added level of complexity in the election management system. There were a lot of problems with the functioning of the Referendum Act after it passed. First off, there was very quickly a kind of a rush to qualify questions for the ballot from all different political camps and interests. And so people on the progressive side of the spectrum circulated some petitions. People on the socially conservative side of the spectrum circulated petitions to ban gay marriage, to eliminate the phase out of nuclear power in Taiwan, to what else is on? Well, I'll show you in a second what all these specific questions are. It's hard to remember them all because they're, yeah. They also, I should note, the ballot wording on a lot of these measures is really confusing, and As we know from the United States, I mean, California holds ballot votes all the time. Often the wording can be construed so that you're voting yes when you really mean no, and no when you really mean yes. And so there's a real problem in terms of writing clear, easy to understand questions for a referendum. And the Central Election Commission in Taiwan was given the task of deciding which of these referendum questions were clear enough, which did not violate existing law, which had actually qualified given the number of signatures submitted. And so the CEC had never had to do any of this before, and so they were faced with this big responsibility for the first time. And they also had to design special voting mechanisms in each polling station, because the group of people who could vote in the candidate elections were not the same as the group of people who could vote for the referendums. And so you just created this big mess. And so as a result, I mentioned some people had 15 pieces of paper. Well, you had it, like in Taiwan, usually you vote very, very quickly and you're out of there in 2 minutes. With 10 referendum questions, many of which caught voters by surprise, you got huge lines because people were actually spending a lot of time just trying to figure out what the main thing said in the polling stations. So you had, in some cases, 2 to 3 hour waits, and this was not because of the local elections. It was because of the referendums that were held at the same time. And then finally, I haven't mentioned this yet. In order to qualify a ballot for the referendum, or qualify a referendum question for the ballot, you have to submit a certain number of signatures. And there were several KMT petitions in particular that the CEC said had a large share of signatures that were forged. And so that's a crime under this law. And so then the CEC documented that these signatures were forged and turned it over to the prosecutor's office. But they had to spend a lot of time kind of carefully documenting all of the signature problems. And so if you haven't gathered by now, I really think the referendum system was a bit of a fiasco this time around. And finally, the referendum law was written in such a way that there's no compulsory execution clause. And so if a referendum passes, there's actually no kind of clear legal steps that follow from that referendum, even though it's supposed to be legally binding. And so, let me show you what the questions were. And I'll show you the results, and then I'll show you what's happened since. So 10 questions. I'll note several of these involved energy policy, and I'm going to pick up on this theme in just a bit when I talk about the results of the elections as well. Energy and pollution are really salient domestic political issues right now in Taiwan. And so there's a proposal to lower the output of thermal power plants by 1% a year. There's a proposal to ban the construction of new coal plants. It's a proposal to ban imports from Fukushima-affected areas in Japan, to limit marriage to one man and a woman, to block LGBT instruction in schools, to support some other form of same-sex rights, although that bill did not specify what, to use Taiwan instead of Chinese Taipei at the Olympics, to permit same-sex marriage. These two were introduced as competitors to these two once these had qualified. And then finally, to repeal a DPP policy to phase out nuclear power. So here's what passed and what failed. Everything that's in green passed. And I have the vote shares on the sides. 7 of 10 passed. And so you would think this is a major public policy statement, a major exercise of the right to weigh in on policy questions by Taiwanese voters. You note the 2 of the 3 that didn't pass were the progressive legislation to encode in law same-sex marriage rights and LGBT instruction in schools. And so this was a kind of conservative electorate on social issues during this election. Since the election, here's what's happened. The chair of the Central Election Commission has had to resign because of the long lines on voting day and the fiasco in counting some of the ballots. The chief of the Judicial Yuan, Taiwan's highest court, has flat out declared that Taiwan's court has already ruled on same-sex marriage. The referendums will not overturn that ruling, and therefore we trump the referendum result, and the legislature still has to implement some kind of same-sex unions. The legislature has started to grudgingly discuss how to implement same-sex civil partnerships, at least in the civil code. The referendum on nuclear phase-out passed, but Tsai Ing-wen has said we're basically, I take that in advisement. The DPP policy is still we support nuclear phase-out by 2025. The Taiwanese trade representatives are still negotiating with Japan about Fukushima imports, and the referendum has perhaps given them some bargaining leverage, but they don't seem to feel under any legal obligation to follow the results of that either. So overall, I think the referendum results have been, they've created a lot of legal confusion. I think none of them have been definitive in terms of policy outcomes for the foreseeable future. So I've said my piece about referendums. Why did the DPP lose this election? Well, first off, this is a nationalized party system. The DPP and the KMT are both very institutionalized. They run candidates all over the island. They're hierarchical organizations who control their own nominations and funding. They have party chapters everywhere. And there's high partisanship for a new democracy in Taiwan. The partisanship, partisans are at least 50% of the electorate. And so if you think in terms, so Taiwan's party system looks more like the American party system than any other party system in Asia, I would argue. So, in fact, the more I study Taiwan, the more it feels like it's being Americanized in some ways. This referendum amendment actually adds to that feeling. And so the models that we have to think about American politics, I would argue, are actually not that foreign to the Taiwanese context and can help us understand a lot about what happens in voting patterns here. So I noted that everything got merged into one omnibus election, one joint election here. Voting in these local elections now is more partisan than the past. The campaigns are nationalized, and so I mentioned earlier that Han Guoyu, the candidate in Kaohsiung, by the end of the campaign was going around campaigning all over the island, and so it kind of became the face of the KMT campaign. And if this had been an election under a previous system, there would have been two races out of everything on the island that he would have been able to affect, Kaohsiung and Taipei, because they were elected separately. Now they're all elected at the same time, and so if you have a popular figure in one of those races, that person can become the face of the party's national campaign and potentially affect voting patterns not just in their own locality but around the island. Second, turnout has been pretty consistent. Particularly since 2000, let's see, what I want to say here is that local turnout and national turnout are very similar now. In fact, in 2016, in the presidential and legislative elections, the turnout was almost exactly the same as it was in the 2018 elections. So that suggests that there's a similar kind of electorate being brought out in these two elections. That did not used to be the case. There used to be a lot of variation across elections. But because they've combined them all now, it's a much more nationalized electorate. Third, and this should ring a bell for people who know anything about American politics, the president of Taiwan has a very low approval rating right now. It's even with the most green-leaning polling companies, they're finding her approval rating below 35% consistently over the last year. And that's a danger zone if you're an incumbent party. So let me show you. So this is a polling company that is pretty green-leaning, and I've taken the polls, but it's the best I could find that actually has regular monthly approval ratings for Tsai Ing-wen. Red is disapprove, green is approve. And you'll note that her numbers over the last few months, her approval ratings have been well below 35%, and her disapproval ratings have been well above 50%. So that's a danger zone for an incumbent party. As a result, I would argue, the DPP, regardless of anything else that happened in the campaign, was already fighting a major headwind, a political headwind. And the KMT didn't have to, it had a built-in advantage in this election, in much the way that the Democrats in the United States in the midterm elections had a built-in tailwind behind them in this election. And so we shouldn't be surprised that there's a bit of a KMT revival and a DPP between. So here's the interesting question. Why does Tsai Ing-wen have a low public opinion approval rating? I'm going to argue a couple of things. First off, there's a tendency for foreign observers to look at Taiwan and say everything has to do with cross-strait relations. It's all about the China question. And I'm going to emphatically argue, no, not in this case. This was not really about cross-strait issues. Beijing has put a lot of pressure on the Tsai administration over the last 2 years, basically ever since she came into office. But Tsai Ing-wen's polling numbers have actually fluctuated a lot. As you can see here, there's some significant spikes, and I want to tell you what's going on here. First off, there was some labor law amendments that took effect in January of 2017. Her negatives spiked when those came into effect. There was a lot of complaints about those amendments. Here, Taiwan suffered through electricity shortages in the summer of 2017, and that was, fairly or not, linked to the DPP's energy policies. There's a jump in her approval rating when she appoints Lai Ching-te, who's a more kind of independence-leaning member of the DPP, as her new premier. That probably rallied some pan-Green voters to support her again, or to approve of her performance. And then finally, we see a similar bump when she appoints Chen Ju, who's another very green member of the DPP, as her Secretary General. And so there's a lot of movement around in these numbers, but not a whole lot of it, to my mind, is associated with cross-strait policy. And it's not really the economy either. There's been pretty steady economic growth over Tsai Ing-wen's term, which starts right about here. I'm going to zoom in on that. There's actually an upward trend if we just take the data we have until the most recent period. This is not the kind of data you would expect if the economy is driving a real revulsion at the incumbent leadership. Instead, what I'm going to argue is that Tsai Ing-wen came into office with a complex coalition behind her that had pretty unrealistic expectations about what she could deliver in a short period of time. And so I'm going to highlight the labor law amendments and energy policy as two issues here. So the labor law amendments were some proposed strengthening of Taiwan's labor law to ensure that Taiwanese workers got at least one rest day every week and then one flex day. And there was a big debate between pro-labor groups and pro-business groups about how stringent to make these requirements. And if you did force workers to work on those days, do you have to pay them overtime, how much overtime, and so on and so forth. And so the DPP hashed out a compromise that was pretty pro-labor in the end, that came out in this January of 2017, and then there was a huge backlash from the business community against this. And then, before I jump into that, then the DPP revisited that issue after Lai Ching-te became premier and watered down the labor law, and so swung it back towards the business community and away from labor. And so in the end, they managed to tick off both components of their coalition. Neither side was very happy, and they were both pretty disillusioned with the DPP government. There's a similar kind of no-win situation involving nuclear power and energy policy in general in Taiwan. So Taiwan gets a significant share of its electricity from nuclear power plants. There are 3 currently in operation. Most of them all 3 are nearing the end of their usable life. And after the Fukushima disaster in Japan in 2011, you'll notice that all of them are on the coastlines. That really sent a shock through Taiwanese society about the potential vulnerability of nuclear plants there. And so the DPP and some of the other DPP coalition members have advocated very strongly for getting rid of nuclear power permanently as soon as possible. The problem is you have to replace nuclear power with something else, and Taiwan, in practice, has done that with coal power generation. And so, fairly or not, when Taiwan has serious air pollution events, that gets linked in voters' minds with this energy policy, and the government gets blamed for it. And so, when I've been down in Kaohsiung the last 2 winters, I've been stunned at the poor air quality. It looks a lot like it did here a couple of weeks ago when we had all the fires, right? That's a consistent pattern in the winter in southern Taiwan. And so that's a very visible manifestation of a problem that people will blame the government for. And then, on top of that, in the summer of 2017, there were consistent energy shortages that a lot of voters blamed on the Tsai administration's energy policy, including a serious blackout in August of 2017. If you've been in Taiwan during the summer, you know it's hot. You want air conditioning, right? So if the power goes out for 12 hours, you're going to be pretty miserable and pretty angry, right? So I don't blame Taiwan voters for being annoyed at the Tsai administration's energy policies. A couple other things. The DPP went after civil servant pensions. This is a core KMT constituency. They decided to cut these pensions in large part because they were completely unsustainable in the long run. They were very, very generous, and they disproportionately benefited old retired KMT cadres. But they fired up the KMT base when they did that. So they cut civil servant and military veterans pensions. And they also went after KMT party assets. And so KMT party members, the core supporters, viewed the DPP administration increasingly as a kind of existential threat to their survival in the political system. And so, to my mind, it's not a surprise that you see this kind of surge in KMT support, because a lot of these folks sat out the last election, and they were motivated to come out this time. So let me sum up. Why is Tsai Ing-wen unpopular? Complex supporting coalition in 2016, unified basically only by dislike of the KMT and Ma Ying-jeou. President Tsai has moved very gradually on a lot of issues, sought consensus within the DPP, and there's been a lot of inevitable frustration. And then the KMT base was demoralized in 2016, but energized in 2018. Right? So quickly, I'll just go through some of the implications of these results for domestic politics, and then I'll turn to cross-strait relations at the end. For the DPP, Tsai Ing-wen had to resign as party chairwoman. Her grip on the party is now much weaker. There's a new acting party chair, the mayor of Geelong. She will probably face an intra-party challenge for the 2020 nomination unless her polling numbers tick way up very quickly, and it's not clear how that might happen. And so her re-election prospects look a lot shakier than they did a week ago. And like, if you had asked me a week ago before the election, would she win re-election in 2020, I'd say above 50%. Now it's definitely below 50%. In addition, she may now have electoral incentives, much like Chen Shui-bian did, to pivot towards her base, which is kind of disillusioned with her on all of these other issues, and try to advocate more strongly for Taiwanese independence or for some other symbolic parts of the Taiwanese nationalist project. And so she may face that pressure going into the election. For the KMT, give them some credit. They actually got their act together in this election. It wasn't clear to any of us in this building that they would after 2016. Their 2020 prospects suddenly look much brighter than they did a week ago. Few people would have predicted that KMT would be able to run a really competitive candidate in 2020. Now that looks increasingly likely. But rather paradoxically, this election has created a much more complex battle for the nomination and for leadership of the party. There's a lot more, what's the saying? Victory has 1,000 fathers, and defeat is an orphan. Well, there's 1,000 fathers who want to claim this victory, who are all going to be angling for the nomination now. And so the KMT has traditionally struggled to kind of balance all these various factions in the run-up to campaigns. They could well have a damaging split again. And they haven't really resolved any of the old tensions that really hurt them in 2014 and 16, the divide between mainlanders and Banshengren and quote native Taiwanese. old versus new generations in the party. They still have, I would argue, fairly limited appeal to young voters, and so on and so forth. For the party system, since this is what I really like to study, Taiwan, I'd emphasize, remains a two-party system, effectively. It's KMT, DPP, and a smattering of independents here and there. But much like the U.S., if you're unhappy with the incumbent, you vote for the major opposition, and in this case, it was the KMT. The prospect of a Ko-Wen-je third-party candidacy in 2020, I thought, was reasonably high before this election, given that he barely won re-election, and he barely won because the DPP pulled a bunch of votes away from him. I think he's in a bad spot if he wants to run in 2020. And so I would predict he doesn't in 2020. There are a lot of swing voters, though, in the electorate. So if you look here, I've got partisanship, KMT, DPP, and other down at the bottom, and then the kind of purple-pink line here is people who do not identify with any political party. Note that they're almost half of the electorate right now. And so the way that you get these massive swings towards the DPP and then towards the KMT is there's a lot of voters who don't have a strong affiliation with either one, according to these data. And so we could see a similar kind of swing towards or away either major party in 2020. I mentioned Ko-Wen-je. I mentioned his results. There's also a dilemma for the New Power Party, which did reasonably well in the local elections. They won seats in the legislature in 2016, in large part because they entered into an electoral coalition with the DPP. The DPP ceded them legislative seats. The New Power Party has since attacked the DPP on a lot of issues, and so it's not clear at all that the DPP will agree to that arrangement again. And if they don't, I don't think the New Power Party will be able to hold on to the seats that they won in the last election. So that's an open question. And then finally, the referendum results suggest that this kind of social progressive or social democratic movement that grew out of the sunflower protests in 2014 is kind of out of step with the public on key issues. In the interest of time, let me wrap up this section and say, so for democracy, Taiwan has so far, at least, I would argue, avoided the kind of populist wave that's really been undermining democratic practice in a lot of other third-wave democracies, particularly in Eastern Europe and in Latin America. So far, despite the win of Han Guoyu, who many people call a populist and say he uses Trumpian language, I would emphasize the fact that he's a former KMT legislator. He's been part of the party for 30 years. He was appointed to a party post as Taipei Agricultural Products Marketing Corporation head. So he's got a long history here. He's not a kind of Duterte or Trumpian-like figure who is coming out and just blowing up the system. He's actually working within the party. Second, the referendum amendments, as you probably gathered, I think have injected a volatile new element into Taiwan politics. I think they're potentially quite problematic for the stability of democracy in Taiwan. The election administration in this election was problematic, and it's suddenly an issue. Taiwan has traditionally had really good election administration, and so this, I think, caught a lot of people by surprise. And then finally, there is some specter of Chinese influence in Taiwanese elections. And this is, so let me preface this by saying, the Chinese have tried to influence Taiwanese elections since at least 1996, when they had missile tests during the run-up to the presidential election there. They have traditionally not been very good at it. The missile tests actually probably raised Li Denghui's vote share in the 96 elections rather than lowered it. And they've since kind of struggled to find ways to effectively shape elections in a way that would further their own interests. Now, I think we need a lot more study on how much and what kinds of influence the Chinese authorities are attempting to exert in Taiwanese elections. But I do think there's significant evidence that they tried to play up Han Guoyu's candidacy. There's a lot of mainland IP addresses that can be linked to views of his social media campaign. But I would argue even when they do try to influence things, Han Guoyu's campaign fell on very dry tinder to take fire. So there was a lot of discontent in Kaohsiung and Han Guoyu once it looked like he was a viable candidate. I think didn't really need Chinese help to capture that election. And finally, I'd note the election wasn't very close. The swing towards the KMT was enormous. And so if election influence is going to matter on the margins maybe in Taiwan, but don't discount the size of the KMT victory here. One thing that I am more worried about is the Chinese language media in Taiwan. There's several newspapers now that have been effectively captured by mainland-linked tycoons. The Zhongguo Shibao is the most obvious one. This used to be kind of the moderate mainline newspaper in Taiwan. Now it really is kind of to the right of the spectrum and advocates a pretty strong Beijing line. You notice it's quite different. The headline here in Chinese is "The government owes us an apology," while all the others are talking about other things. And so there's a very kind of strong anti-DPP line in this paper. Finally, just briefly, implications for cross-Strait and U.S.-Taiwan relations. CCP in Beijing is going to view this, I think, as a win, and likely to think its Taiwan policy continues to work. Its squeeze play on the Tsai administration is probably going to continue. Any outreach that it does will be to the new KMT mayors. It will attempt to bypass, like it did during the late Chen Shui-bian era, the central government in Taipei and directly interact with the new KMT mayors. And it will continue this kind of economic benefit targeted strategy at people that it thinks might favor its cause. It's not obvious going forward, and especially if the KMT wins in 2020, how Beijing would deal with a new KMT president. In particular, I don't have time to get into the details here, but it's not clear to me that the 1992 consensus, which the KMT is kind of latched onto as the formulation that will allow it to speak directly to Beijing, will still be acceptable to Beijing in 2020. I can talk more about that in the Q&A. U.S.-Taiwan relations, I don't see any change in the short run. Both the DPP and the KMT are well known to the United States. We've worked well with both. The chairman of AIT is here with the Taiwan foreign minister. This is after the election. These kind of exchanges still happen and will continue to happen. The U.S., I think, will continue to back the Tsai administration in the face of Beijing's pressure campaign, despite the results of this election. The Tsai administration has implemented some important reforms to the defense and security strategies. I think those will continue. The open question in my mind is whether Tsai will give in to the temptation to pull what I'm calling a Chen Shui-bian and kind of pivot to her flank, her pro-independence flank, in order to try to maintain her grip on the nomination for 2020. And the final question I have is, who are the candidates in 2020? It's actually less clear now than it was a week ago, much less clear. And so this is the thing to watch over the next year and beyond. All right, thanks.
So, Kharis, you want to, that was fantastic. Do you want to just take your own questions then?
Yeah, let's open it up to the floor, and I apologize for going a little over my allotted time here, so I'll try to be brief in my responses to Q&A. Yes?
Hi, my name is Jacob Reeded. I'm a graduate student here in sociology. I have a question about the nomination process in local elections. For say like city and county, below city and county mayors, say like council members and below, are those nominations generally made by the local city and mayor party leaders, or are they made more by National Assembly members? Who kind of, I mean, I know it's all informal and behind closed doors, right? But kind of who do local prospective candidates go to seek the nomination, and who are the nomination patrons?
Yeah. So there's not one clear answer to that question. It varies across party, and it's varied across time and across locality. But the general picture is that the party chapters at the local level, especially in the DPP, have a lot of influence over who they nominate in the local council races. There's the specific procedures to nominate candidates have changed over time, but it typically involves a local poll. So there's a polling score for each potential candidate, and then there's some party vote as well. And the KMT has come a little later to this system, but it also uses a similar system, especially at the higher up levels. I mentioned that it's complicated because in some localities there are local power brokers who do play a pretty significant role in saying, no, you cannot run, or yes, you can run because you're part of my faction. And then the final thing I'll say is that factions are still very important, especially at the local level. So there are longtime factions which may not be closely tied to either political party, but have a faction head who says, all of our candidates or our voters are going to support this party's candidates or this slate of candidates within a party, or vice versa. And so, generally speaking, we're moving towards more party control rather than less over the last 10 years or so, but there's still a lot of variation at the local level. Yeah, Kaiwan?
May I ask some question about the
Could you identify yourself,
Could you
please?
use the mic?
Hi, can I ask some question about the
Could you identify yourself, please?
I'm Kaiwan. I'm the second-year master's student in East Asian Studies. And may I ask some constitutional impact of this election outcome? In 2014, when the KNT lose the election, the Premier Zhang Yihua, he resigned. At this time, when the DPP lost the Premier election, he attempted to resign, but Tsai Ing-wen rejected his resignation. Instead, Tsai resigned from her president of DPP. So may I ask, do you think it is a good sign for Taiwan constitution that separate the responsibility and the power between president and the premier?
I like this version of taking responsibility better than the 2014 version because the defeat, Lai Ching-te and the national government were not formally on the ballot this time around, but the party's candidates were. And so Tsai Ing-wen, as the chairwoman of the DPP, I think should resign to take responsibility if that's if your expectation is that you need somebody's head to roll as a result of this election, it should be the party chairperson first and foremost. It has never made much sense to me to blame the premier for various problems in governments because ultimately the premier is basically a chief of staff for the president. And the president can hire the premier and fire the premier at will. And so Lai Ching-te is basically doing whatever Tsai Ing-wen wants him to do, or he wouldn't be in that position. He could be fired tomorrow, easily. His attempt to resign, I think, was in keeping with past tradition, where when there's a bad political result, this is especially on the KMT side, there's a bad political result, you submit your resignation to take responsibility. I think Tsai made the right move by keeping him on, both in constitutional terms and in political terms. I'll note that she's not entirely a disinterested party in keeping Lai Ching-te in the premiership. One is, he's more popular than she is. He's a potential competitor for the nomination in 2020. And so by keeping him on her team, she makes it harder for him to run an independent campaign and say, I'm a completely new face. I can bring our party back from our kind of terminal decline. I could pull us out of the spiral. He's now part of the problem rather than part of the solution in many DPP members' eyes. And so I think Tsai is being smart by keeping him on the team rather than putting him outside where he could do a lot of damage to her. Yes, sir?
So, Kharis, on this topic of PRC, called Influence Operations Summit, said sharp power, which is getting a lot more currency now around the world with studies to include Asia Society and some other organizations. About a year and a half ago, commissioned a group to look at this question, and the task force just released its findings in its report. In fact, next Tuesday,
Yes.
we're at noon, we're going to have a interesting panel here, which Kharis
You're all
is-
invited.
Yes.
Please. Yeah.
noon and...
Noon in this room.
Great,
in fact.
yeah. Yeah, in fact, Kharis will be introducing it. I'll be moderating it. We have Larry Diamond from Stanford here who will be part of the panel. Should be very interesting. At any rate, to get to your topic, Kharis, you had noted, I thought very interestingly, that trying to look ahead, that China, the mainland, may look at opportunities here with new KMT elected mayors and try to influence then politics through them. What would be the tools that they would have available? And then the second question is the KMT vulnerable? Have they been vulnerable, or if you speculate over the next few years, could they become very vulnerable then, even as China uses, mainland uses more soft power economic tools? Could they be vulnerable to local criticisms that they're being manipulated?
Yeah, excellent questions. Well, the first thing I'll note is that the attempts to kind of woo KMT mayors or local officials are not a new thing. They went on during the Chen Shui-bian administration as well. After Beijing decided that they just could not deal with Chen, they would just ignore him, then they sought out alternative partners, and KMT mayors were the first people they turned to. And so this is, Taiwan, unlike most of the rest of the world, has dealt with this issue for a long time. The kinds of tools that they might use, so I'll give you one specific example. Liu Xiaoyan, who just won in Taichung, has already proposed, so this past summer, Beijing forced the cancellation of the Asian Youth Games, which were going to be held in Taichung, which was this big kind of coup for Taichung, would put them on the international stage. Lin Jialong, the mayor, had really been playing this up, and they did that very clearly to try to stick it to the DPP mayor there. Liu Xiaoyan, even before she's come into office, is already talking about trying to get that decision reversed now. And so Beijing could reverse that decision. They could take it back to the council that makes these decisions and say, our previous objections have been dealt with, we're okay with it going to Taichung now. And so that's the kind of incentives they could dangle in front of KMT mayors, and I'm sure that the KMT leadership would, they'll eat that up, because that potentially could win them votes. They've also targeted, in the past, the PRC has done things like special tariff-free imports from southern Taiwan. Things like milkfish, for instance, was a big product in southern Taiwan that under the Ma administration, their export numbers to mainland China skyrocketed. There was, I think I saw an article a week or so ago about milkfish farmers complaining that the prices had just plummeted for those that weren't making any money on them. They could change that policy again and target it specifically at products or events or policies that disproportionately affect certain localities that have KMT leadership. I think that's one. And then your second question
was, could KMT leaders and the party be vulnerable then to criticisms of accepting that and it not being in the greater interest of Taiwan?
Absolutely. And the Exhibit A is the 2014 and 16 elections, where Ma Ying-jeou was trying to make a case that the KMT had delivered all of these benefits to Taiwan by signing all of these agreements with the PRC and opening up sectors of the economy to PRC investment and vice versa. And there was a real backlash against that, because people were, number one, suspicious about the Chinese motives, as they should be, and number two, suspicious about the breadth of the benefits. The benefits did not appear to be spreading as widely as the Ma administration asserted they would. And so, for instance, among tourist groups, there were very specific tourist agencies that got a lot of the benefit from Chinese tourist groups coming over. And there weren't many independent Chinese travelers, and so mom and pop hostels weren't making a whole lot of money out of that, but there were politically connected groups that were, and the KMT is very politically vulnerable to that kind of criticism going forward. Thanks. Okay, yeah.
Hi, my name is Sophia Deng. Two questions. First one is about the election result. If there are any digital data available or any possibility some or most of the election results could have been rigged, like the Russian influence, but Taiwan is Chinese influence. And second question is actually was about this the National Security Department of Council, the head of the council mentioned about the data breach by the infrastructure, 3G data infrastructure, which was built by Huawei. And in 2011, actually that's according to CIA reported, in 2011 that Huawei received a lot of funds from the Chinese government to build the data, the 3G infrastructure in Taiwan.
On the first question, is there any credible evidence that the election results as reported were not actually an accurate reflection of the voters' will or the voters' preferences? And let me preface this by saying this was a more turbulent election, voting and counting, than there ever has been before in Taiwan, at least in recent memory. But that said, the Taiwanese voting system is very, very robust to rigging or any other kind of hacking, much more so than the United States, much more so than most other Western democracies, because they use very simple paper ballots. And I mentioned the paper ballots were kind of a problem in this election. It's also the case you have all the ballots right there. They're counted as soon as the polls close, and they're counted in front of everyone. I've actually been witness to multiple election counting events where, you know, the poll workers are right there. You see the ballot box. It's open. They count each one individually, call it out. Anybody who wants can go in, and then the final numbers are reported outside the polling place. Anybody who wants to come by, including reporters or observers from either campaign, can come by and note it. It's all very, very transparent, very efficient, very accurate, and ultimately quite legitimate and trustworthy. And so there's no indication, in my mind, that there was even an attempt to rig this election. The way traditionally that Taiwanese elections have come under some scrutiny has been before the election, during the campaigns. Vote buying is the big scourge of Taiwanese elections. And so there's been a long-standing effort by prosecutors in Taiwan to try to stamp out vote buying and prosecute it very heavily. So generally speaking, despite the problems in this election, I think the Taiwanese results are quite credible. The KMT victory here is real. It's not some kind of a padding of the vote that happened illegitimately. It's a real win, and I think that first and foremost you have to take that seriously. Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you for your talk. My name is Forsu, and I'm a member of the community. As I listened to your talk, I could not help but think of the number of other surprise election results in Western Europe, Italy, Germany, the UK, how existing parties and coalitions got weakened, and in Italy completely changed the landscape. And that's not even mentioning what happened in Eastern Europe. My question is, as a specialist, you as a specialist and others who focus on Taiwan, what did you miss? What lessons were there for you to go back and ask yourself whether the process by which you analyze the landscape needs to be revisited? Because as a layperson, I'm consistently surprised by why the specialists get it wrong. And is it really the plague of the specialists that is causing them to not be able to predict these things more accurately and then essentially end up commenting on the results?
Yes, it's a great question. So let me defend my own position here. I was not one of the people who thought the KMT was in terminal decline after 2016, and I said as much in the week after the election. We did another one of these after the 2016 elections, and I actually predicted that the Tsai administration would have a lot of difficulties satisfying this coalition, like in January 2016, right after she won. So I actually am not surprised by these results in the same way that a lot of people who comment on Taiwan, I think, have been surprised. The thing that I would emphasize that is different in Taiwan from Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Canada even, is this is a very institutionalized party system. And
Just like the U.S.
Just like the U.S.
And there was a surprise here too.
Well, there was a surprise if you think it's surprising that a Democratic incumbent should lose office after 8 years. There is a kind of pendulum, very consistent pendulum swing in the United States between the two major parties over and over. And so the people who were surprised thought that wouldn't happen this time around because the Republicans nominated such a terrible candidate and nobody would ever vote for him. If you were willing to kind of put the candidate aside and just look at the underlying partisan dynamics, I don't think the U.S. Outcome is actually that surprising. Similarly in Taiwan, I would argue, there's a kind of pendulum swing now between the two major parties, and the people who are surprised are the ones who thought the KMT was doomed and going down the toilet after 2016. And the KMT is a very old party. It's been around a long time. It's adapted to significant crises throughout its history, and to this point, it showed a remarkable amount of resiliency. And so, let me wrap this up by saying Taiwan is really an outlier among young democracies compared to, say, Hungary, Poland, Italy, you mentioned, where the party system has blown up several times in the last 2 decades. Taiwan has had, in 1992, when Taiwan had their first contested elections, the first place party was the KMT, the second place party was the DPP. In 2016, the first place party was the DPP, the second place party was the KMT. Italy has gone through like 3 party systems over that same time period. And so this is a very stable system. And those expecting it to blow up and for there to be a third force that emerges under Ko-Wen-je or under the New Power Party, I think need to grapple with the fact that Taiwan is an outlier in the institutionalized, stabilized side of the spectrum rather than the inchoate or unstable side of the spectrum. Yes?
Hi, Chaitin Ye from Katakana Media. Just really quick, you mentioned the 1992 consensus, especially if in 2020 there is a KMT president.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so an excellent question. I didn't have time to elaborate on it here, but thanks for the cue, actually. The 1992 consensus refers to a meeting between a representative of the then unelected KMT government under Li Denghui and a representative of the Chinese Communist Party, where they effectively agreed on a kind of one China principle, that both sides of the strait, Taiwan and mainland China, are part of one China. There's not 2 countries on either side of the strait, or one China, one Taiwan. But they effectively agreed to disagree about which China they were referring to. So to the KMT, this was the Republic of China. The Republic of China is the rightful government of all of China, including the mainland. And to the CCP, it was the PRC, the People's Republic of China, and that's the rightful government of all of China. And that formulation, although it's kind of, there's a lot of lawyerly arguments in there, that formulation is effectively what Ma Ying-jeou endorsed when he became president in 2008, and Beijing accepted that as the grounds for a kind of the acknowledgement of Beijing's position that the two sides were, they were able to set aside some of the sovereignty questions and just talk about signing other kinds of economic agreements. And so the Ma administration had that formulation and use that as kind of the key to open relations. What I'm concerned about in 2020 is that Beijing has never accepted the KMT expression of 各自表述. So each side with their own interpretations. Beijing has just ignored that part, but kind of let Taipei say it. And we'll pretend you didn't, and we'll kind of get on to practical concerns. What I'm concerned about now is that they won't ignore that anymore. They might not. And they might say, whoever the KMT leader is, they need to acknowledge our position full stop, and this 各自表述 cannot be there anymore. And that means that the 92 consensus is no longer the key to opening cross-strait relations. That would be a harder line than what they took with Ma Ying-jeou, and they may feel like they have the leverage now to force that on whoever becomes president in 2020. And so that would then create a major problem for the KMT in their dealings with Beijing. Okay, yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm an undergrad here. So my question is about the future of democracy in Taiwan. So under the rising threats from China, and do you think democracy in Taiwan is getting more vulnerable or actually more robust? And how hard, what's the future of it?
Yeah. So let me start by saying I think Taiwan's democracy scores very well by any kind of comparative metric right now. For instance, Freedom House, when it rates democracies around the world, currently rates Taiwan's democracy higher than the United States. That is both in part because Taiwan has improved over the last several years, but also because the United States has taken a significant downturn. But that gives you an idea of just how well regarded it is in comparative terms. I would rank it significantly better than South Korea, for instance, right now. Taiwan has a more robust kind of public forums. It has better protections for freedom of speech. South Korea has banned a pro-North Korean party. In Taiwan, there's still the Chinese Unification People's Party that's allowed to contest elections. They never win anything, but Taiwan allows that to happen. So Taiwan's democracy is pretty robust right now, I would argue. It's in pretty good shape, despite the sort of election problems we had this time around. My worry is not that there will be some kind of insidious manipulation of the vote or of public opinion. My worry is governance. And you probably got that from my talk today. The major problems that threaten Taiwan's democracy are domestic, and they're about addressing these really kind of fundamental concrete issues like how do we keep the lights on? How do we make sure the air is clean? How do we ensure that the roads are safe, that there's no train accidents like we just had? There's a lot of very concrete things that Taiwanese government has traditionally done pretty well, and they've gained a lot of legitimacy from that. If there's constant political conflict, constant disagreement, a lack of solutions to a lot of these critical issues, that's when they become vulnerable then to outsider appeals and potentially to Chinese manipulation. Much more, I think, that's a much sicker regime.
I think we probably, Kharis, have time for one more question. I think we've got
Okay.
a student.
Ben? Ben.
I'm Ben Cho. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CSAC downstairs. Kharis, thanks so much for the presentation today. I have two quick questions. One is, there seems to be a curious correlation between the fact that we had referendums this year, this election, and this somewhat surprising outcome. So how much do you think the referendum affected the outcome, and which way do you think the bias was more kind of pervasive? Second, and related on that, somewhat differently, how much do you think the outcome will affect Taiwan's policy towards Beijing? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? On the one hand, she might have less authority. On the other hand, she might try and put up potential again. So how much should we be concerned about how things will change?
Yeah. So how much did the referendums drive this result? They were concurrent, so the same people turning out mostly because they cared about a referendum issue were also presumably going to vote in the local elections as well. And so I think it may, and in fact that was explicitly the motivation for some of the groups who put referendum measures on the ballot, particularly on the KMT side. They wanted to use it to gin up turnout. I haven't done this analysis, but there's a political scientist at UNLV who's actually looked at correlations, and there's a fair amount of correlation between the KMT-sponsored referendums. There's not a whole lot of correlation between the others, and I haven't actually delved into how he ran the analysis, so I'll have to kind of punt on the details. But my suspicion is that the referendums probably raised pan-blue turnout and just generally conservative turnout a little bit relative to what the baseline would have been. There may have been, it's easy to tell a story where pan-blue supporters who really have been disgusted with the KMT for the last 4-6 years decided that they really didn't want gay marriage, or they really wanted to vote against coal plants, and turned out because of those issues first and foremost. And then once they were there, decided, well, I might as well vote for the KMT in this election as well. That's a plausible explanation, I think. But like a lot of these questions, what we really need is individual level survey data to answer them definitively. We'll have that, but it'll be another 6 months before it's publicly available. So stay tuned if you're really interested in that. And your last point was about Tsai Ing-wen and her motivations over the next couple of years in cross-strait relations. So Tsai Ing-wen is just personality-wise, she's a very cautious, careful, pragmatic politician, and her cross-strait policy has really reflected that. It was crafted very carefully in the run-up to the 2016 elections. She consulted very closely with the United States about what she would say in her inauguration speech. She sent out feelers to Beijing, and Beijing basically has given her the cold shoulder ever since. And so she got very, very little payoff politically from taking that kind of moderate, cautious approach to cross-strait relations. And so the question now is, what kind of politician is she going to be for the next 14 months? And whether she will continue on that cautious path and say, it's too dangerous to play around, to play political games with cross-strait relations. I'm going to stick with this moderate path and try to recover on other issues. Or she could say, screw it. Beijing has given me nothing. I've gotten nothing out of this careful, pragmatic approach. I'm going full chun shui bian. I'm going to try to rally the pro-independence cause to my ticket, and I'm fighting an underdog battle here, and I'm going to, look for any opportunity to score political points against the opposition and put them on the defensive. And so, I don't know. Actually, I don't know which of those Tsai Ing-wen is likely to take. I would note the second of those options would be a pretty dramatic departure from her entire political career to this point. And so, if she's fighting for her political survival, she might feel like she has to do that, but it would be surprising if she did go in that direction, just given the kind of politician she's been in the past.
So, Kharis, that was absolutely a superb intellectual feat of arms here in explaining this very complicated election and its consequences. Thank you very much, and all of you have a good weekend.